I got to know Victor Gruen before he died and before he moved back to Europe. He was out in Southern California, where I was living at the time, and he was, and Victor Gruen was crushed. You know, he's the architect that invented regional malls, and he was European, and he thought he was bringing European culture to the U.S., and he came to realize that he had created these sterile places, and he literally was, I mean, he became quite depressed as an old man when he moved back to Europe. And he, of course, also thought that closing streets would make sense as well. And again, there were 196 closed streets in this country, and every single one of them basically put a bullet in the head of a dying downtown, except for 3. Lincoln in Miami Beach, 3rd Street in Santa Monica, Boulder, and I guess really there's 4th with Charlottesville. But in all 4 cases, they struggled mightily. They hung in there for forever. But we'll see it come back. And again, you just have to go to Europe to see it, but look at the precondition before you close the streets. Closing of the streets is something you do only after you have phenomenal density, a lot of housing within walking distance, and a lot of transit to have great accessibility there. Only then.
There's one theme that's been developing in the questioning, and you brought it up a number of times, Mr. Leinberger, and that is in regard to affordable housing. And I'm going to give one very well thought out question by one of the attendees. If it's going to take a generation to address the pent up demand for walkable urbanism, what does that mean for who gets to live in walkable urbanism? This individual says, as a public sector employee who's a millennial, will walkable urban ever be affordable for me?
Let me first analyze or give you some financial background on why it costs so much. There's 2 basic reasons. One is walkable urban construction costs between 50 and 100% more on a price per square foot basis. And that's because it's better built. High density means you have real foundations, not these little silly little foundations that rest on blocks, and that you have to have serious structural support to go up multiple floors. It might even get to be reinforced concrete or steel. Steel just drives the price literally up 100%. Reinforced concrete is about 50, 70% higher than a stick construction. So that's one. And how we generally adopt to that is that we skinny down. We don't have 4,000 square foot homes. We live in a 2,000 or 1,500 square foot home. And that seems to work. 1,500 square feet seems to be big enough for most of us, or 1,000, or some number that you can in fact live in. The second reason is land, the land price under it. And I'll give you one example of the most shocking example I've seen. Capitol Riverfront down by the Navy Yard, 12 years ago, you may remember, was a place that you wouldn't be caught dead in. Then again, you might have been. It was pretty nasty. And land values there 12 years ago were about $5 a square foot. Now that doesn't mean much to you, but just keep that in mind. Toll Brothers, the luxury condo and single family home builder, closed on 29,000 square feet there 18 months ago for $825 per square foot. I have never seen price appreciation that steep over that short of a period of time, ever. That's the pent-up demand. That's the land price. Now, the thing is, we've got no shortage of land in this country. We stole this land fair and square, and we have a lot of it. What we have a shortage of is walkable urban land. So a townhouse in DuPont Circle, townhouse sells for about $2 million in DuPont Circle. The land underneath of it is 1,500 square feet. It's worth $1.2 million. The structure is worth $800,000. The land is worth $1.2 million. That's stupid. And it's because we've not built enough land. Now, so that's the explanation. There's about 14, literally 14 different arrows in the quiver of how to address affordable housing. And I don't want to go into all of them, just ones that come to mind, obviously, cash helps. Cash never hurts. All the tax credit programs, increase them. They're de minimis compared to what we spend on sprawl in this country, as Smart Growth America has recently proven. But one of the simplest things to do is to allow granny flats. Have auxiliary rental units in all of your single-family neighborhoods and in all your, high-density neighborhoods. Make it legal. You may have seen on HGTV, I think it's Property Brothers or Income Property, one of them. My wife loves them, and I've become addicted to it, where they go into, obviously, a Canadian, because this stuff all comes out of Canada, where it is legal, and they take a basement and turn it into a rental unit for a first-time home buyer, and they slash their mortgage in half or more. And then they rent it out as great affordable housing. But it's illegal in almost every jurisdiction in this country. I bet, and since you can't prove it, I can throw this number out and you won't be able to contradict me. There's 200 million empty bedrooms in this country that could be rented, but it's illegal to rent them. That's a huge affordable housing stock. So that's just one of the 14 ways that we can use.
I think that it's important first to start where you did, which is that we've got this big gap. If we do 2% a year, it would still take us a generation to try and catch up. I mean, there was a time, after all, when everything was walkable, even all the poor neighborhoods. The problem is we have this gap between where our country wants to be, where the market is, and what we have in supply. So what that means, to go right to the question that the person asked, is that for at least a generation, and perhaps more, if we want our communities that are becoming walkable, more transit accessible, closer to jobs, all those things, if we want them to be affordable to people of low and moderate income, then we do have to intervene. It will take a concerted, sustained action on the part of government, particularly local government. It'd be nice if we had help from state and federal government, but local government is the first line for this, over that period in order to be able to maintain diversity in our communities and to answer that question affirmatively to somebody who's saying, I'm not a wealthy person, will I get to live there? That is what we're trying to do in Arlington through a number of different ways, and I want to particularly point to something that is in fact on the agenda for the county board this Saturday, and will be again, it's in a couple of parts, we'll be back in December as well, because it's a good example of A, the problem, and B, our attempts to address it, and that has to do with the plan for Columbia Pike. We did, of course, adopt a lot of what Chris was talking about in terms of facilitating the development side to create, through our form-based code, the kind of places that we want, the kind of built environment we want along Columbia Pike. But we were also very concerned and remain concerned about maintaining the diversity that is part of that community, and particularly the diversity of the housing stock that allows for the diverse people stock that we have. And in order to do that, we've committed, first of all, in the plan to something. When we adopted the overall plan in July 2012, we made a commitment that Arlington had never gone quite as far as, up to that point, and that as far as I know, no community has gone so far as this, to say that having inventoried the affordable housing stock that's there, the market rate housing that is threatened, we said we are committed to 100% preservation of the stock up to 60% of median income, and from 60 to 80% of median income. And now to get to that, we need a variety of tools, and we've been incorporating a number of those. Some of them are tools that we've had, that Chris mentioned cash, particularly through our Affordable Housing Investment Fund. That's going to be part of it. So a lot of what we're going to do is part of, is basically what we have been doing, using some of the tools that we've already had to create 6,000 units of committed affordable housing in this county. But we're adding new tools. So the new development model, the new the form-based code that we're putting in place includes a provision so that new development will incorporate affordable housing. It's the first time I know of the form-based code has been used in this country to have an inclusionary zoning provision, basically. And that's a portion of it, and only a portion. We recognize we need a number of other tools, so we're looking at several other things, which again will be before the board in the next 2 months, including the use of a tax increment financing approach to help finance some of the aspects of affordable housing, particularly some of the things we haven't addressed. The housing fund we've used is mostly it's basically providing loan money that's a bridge loan between low-income tax credit and conventional lending, and I don't want to get into a lot of details, but there are a lot of things that are expenses that make it hard for people to provide affordable housing that are normally just part of the development costs. We're going to try and lower the development costs for affordable housing providers through the use of funds that will be generated in part by the TIF. And there are a number of other things that we're working on. And I think it's important for people to be aware that these are issues we're actually struggling with right now, and that we have before the county board and will continue to have, and they're really good things for people to engage on, because really the only way we're going to be able to meet this challenge is to continue to fund in good times and bad, and to come up with newer tools that will there's no one of them that's going to solve the whole problem, but together they will help us put this whole thing together.
While we've done some research from communities around the country, this is something new. How we use TDR, transfer development rights, to preserve those units, to provide an economic incentive, how we structure the deal, if you will, on both the sending site and the receiving site in Arlington is something very new. It's going to require us to play a more active role in a transfer development rights program than we have in the past. So there'll be a lot of discussion about this. We recently had discussion with our Planning Commission. I think there's more work to be done, but it's a key part of one of these new tools that Chris has talked about. Jason, why don't we go on to the next question?
Okay, there's another theme developing in the questions, and I apologize, we're not going to get to every question tonight. There's a lot of good questions here, but I'm going to try to pull out some of the themes. And one of the items that's popping up and kind of hit a chord, I think, was the connection to the waterfront. And I think it's something we've thought about in the planning department, and future generations are going to probably be looking towards the waterfront and how do we access that and do things that were similarly done in Washington, D.C. So given Park Service control along a good chunk of the waterfront, the highway is in the way. You mentioned what the highways do in Fairfax and how the metro corresponds to that. You also brought up air rights. So what do we do in the county, and how can we leave our future generations a gift, if you might?
This, of course, takes a lot of study and a lot of great design work and a lot of creativity. But obviously, there's a great phrase from another one of those movies that I make my students watch, the Karate Kid. When Mr. Miyagi is asked by Daniel-san, how can he stop, he's being beat up by his high school friends, how can he make that stop? And Mr. Miyagi says, best defense, no be there. So the best way to get rid of a problem is to tear out the suckers. And that's happened throughout the country. The most impressive examples, of course, were the 32nd Act of God Redevelopment Act out in San Francisco with the Embarcadero. The property tax values around the Embarcadero went up 200%. That place is now a spectacular community gathering spot, jogging spot, art spot that connects downtown San Francisco to the water. In Milwaukee, John Norquist, when he was mayor, tore out a freeway. So this is happening throughout the country. Finally, DC's got to do it with that absolutely ridiculous freeway, Whitehurst. And they will have to tear it out, because to rebuild it, it's been up 50 years. Things only last 40, 50 years until you have to fundamentally rebuild it. That goes back to the Garrison Keillor phrase. And the citizens of DC are not going to put up with $500 million or more to rebuild that thing. So it's going to go. And but people are driving less, as I mentioned earlier. We don't need them as much. We can turn them into parkways. We can turn them into gentle roads with roundabouts. They don't have to be freeways. They can be buried. They can be decked over. But the issue is that the land value there is so important. It's so expensive. It's so valuable. Valuable both financially and valuable from a quality of life point of view. That to put it under asphalt and not have access to it is criminal. And one way or the other, you're going to either rip them out or you're going to turn them into parkways. And the Park Service is just going to have to recognize that they're in a democracy too. It's happening in the district as the Park Service is being beat up by the place managers to let them activate those parks. So once they crack the Park Service, you can take another whack at them.
I like everything you said, but there is a different reality here. Unfortunately, the entire waterfront for Arlington was handed over to the federal government in an act in 1930. Somebody here might remember the exact year, like 32 or somewhere in the early 30s, I believe it was. And so basically, Arlington doesn't have any waterfront that it controls, and that is a real difficult political reality. Every place that has these waterfront highways has a set of political problems to deal with in convincing people it's a good idea to get rid of them. We have a really different problem in that it isn't even our state highway department. It's the Park Service, and just to get an idea, the getting access to the water is clearly important in a lot of ways, and in discussions for many years now about how to revitalize Roslyn, one of the things people focus on is how do you get access to that. And we have spent the last 20 years trying to just get access to get a boathouse, something for canoes, and rowing shells and that sort of thing, nothing motorized, just to get access to the water. And a lot of the time has been fighting the Park Service, which says, you're violating a national park and a memorial to George Washington, kind of ignoring the fact that they're operating a superhighway with tens of thousands of cars going by, spewing emissions, but our boathouse would be a threat to that. Now, to be fair, things have been moving along, and there have been a number of studies, and perhaps they're getting closer to something that could actually work, and it's possible that we'll see something to come together. But this is to be able to now pay to get a structure to take us over the highway so people can then launch their canoes. I do think that would be a great asset because water is so valuable. But it shows the level on which we're dealing with this, where the land itself is owned by the federal government and by an agency that views everything they have as national park land, which technically it is, and that their goal is to keep people out of it, except of course for the tens of thousands of cars that drive on the highway. That's one limitation. There are a couple of things though that are worth thinking about, and we have done some thinking about. One is 4 Mile Run, a body of water to the south, which we do have some ability to deal with. Now there we also have to deal with the Corps of Engineers, and we have been, and actually they in recent years were quite cooperative with us and the city of Alexandria, which is on the other side, in developing a plan for 4 Mile Run. We need a lot more funding to make things happen there, but long term, that's clearly an opportunity where the waterfront can be an asset, and we'll see something happening. As far as taking highway structures down, just the last thing I'll mention, we do have a highway structure though that I think that really could come down and would be a good thing in the future, and that does concern Crystal City. What is basically Route 1 Jefferson Davis Highway comes off the highway, and we have that whole elevated structure that essentially divides Crystal City and creates this big barrier. Long term, that's a really good candidate to get rid of, to submerge and deck over or something, and I do think that that's in the future.
So the issue of, that highway, you've got about 5-10 years until you have to start planning the fundamental rebuilding of it. Don't let the engineers just take hold of that. And be thinking about a boulevard, be thinking about a much more calm way, and you'll get the same throughput, even though you don't have to get as much throughput because people are driving less, and they will be even driving less more in the future. But who wants to spend the hundreds of millions of dollars to just make it the same when it could be so much better?
Well, as Board Member Zimmerman and some of our planning commissioners know, we're having that discussion about that boulevard or an esplanade opportunity to provide very long-term connection along the edge of Roslyn, and possibly in the very long term, if we are able to develop air rights. And that discussion is just beginning with the Commonwealth of Virginia, who's become very interested in our air rights in Roslyn. And it's something that we're going to address as part of the Realize Roslyn sector plan update that's now well underway. So more to come on that. Chris?
Yeah, and I was going to tag on to that because Realize Roslyn is the opportunity for us to think boldly. And we constantly challenge the consultants to think beyond that. And there's talk about connecting to the Esplanade. Sat in on a meeting a couple days ago with the developers of Roslyn Plaza. And the thought is should the open space open to the water? Someone made a comment, but there's a highway in between and it's so noisy. Cars are getting quieter. We rode in a Prius down here. There will be a future when things will be much quieter. And we need to think about the development that we're looking at today on the drawing boards in a future where there's fewer cars. So as we discuss the opportunities, it's important for the community to challenge folks like myself, the planning staff, to think outside the box and envision a day when there are flying cars and envision a day when they're a lot quieter and then we can make those connections. I'm from the Cincinnati area. If you've been to Cincinnati 20 years ago, the complete waterfront was all paved, it was asphalt. Today, it's a living mixed-use community that is some of the highest priced real estate in the Cincinnati area because they made that bold move to reconnect with the river, which is what their origins were. So I think from a planning perspective, we got to continue to challenge the developers to make those connections, to make that investment, and that we also need to think as urban designers, with your encouragement, outside the box for a day when those highways are not severing us from our assets.
Thanks, Chris. Another theme.
Okay. I would be happy with a hoverboard. I don't need a flying car. That'd be, I'm cool with that. So just remind people, hashtag roundabouts. We're getting a lot of people tweeting actually, so I'm happy for that. And I'm happy to take questions through that medium as well. So given the great demand for walkable urban places, is there any chance Arlington can expand boundaries of the high density areas around our metro stations?
First, I guess I'd question the premise. I don't necessarily think that we need to do that. Two things. One is we're not through building in those areas. Even the Roslyn-Ballston corridor, which is, more than halfway done, still has a lot of places that need to be redeveloped. There still are some car lots out there, and there's some older buildings that really need to be replaced. With the stuff that's being envisioned for Roslyn, that will mean an awful lot of development that would need to take place. Crystal City is a tremendous area that a tremendous amount of new density that is envisioned if we're to realize the vision in the plan that was adopted 3 years ago now. Pentagon City isn't really even half done. Potomac Yards is all approved but not half built. So we have these metro station areas that have still tremendous amount of capacity for development. That means that they'll absorb more people in offices, but it also means that there'll be more life generated in the area that will produce the benefits on the ground level. You don't necessarily need to go a whole lot beyond that. When you add in places like Columbia Pike on a different scale, but creating much of this walkable environment as well, and potentially with some of the planning that's just getting started on Lee Highway, and people are interested in seeing what can be done on Lee Highway, again, a different model than a Roslyn or a Ballston, but nonetheless looking for new opportunities for walkable walkable urbanity, as Chris likes to call it, perhaps even on a smaller scale. That's a lot of stuff. And it isn't that when you leave those areas they're to be non-walkable. Part of the policies that we've really tried to make explicit in recent years is that we want the whole county to be walkable. It won't all be high density, and I don't think it should. The ultimate answer to could you expand the area around the metro sector is, well, what are you doing to expand the transit then? Because what makes it work is the high capacity transit that makes it possible to have these streets not have all that car traffic. If you start adding higher and higher density, and again, this is all relative, right? Because you can have pretty compact development at pretty modest density levels even when you don't have transit. But if you push that out, then to some degree you're going to be undermining the system because you're going to be adding it in places where you'll generate more car traffic and you won't necessarily have the transit capacity for it. So in the long run, if you want to have very extensive, walkable, dense urban areas, like in a big downtown, DC or Chicago or New York or something like that, then you really need a kind of transit grid to go along with it, which is what they have in the Loop area of Chicago or in Manhattan or something like But I really don't think we're up against that kind of limitation. What we need to do is get built the stuff that we have already provided for. That's a good generation and more of development that is possible under the existing plans. Certainly, if you augment them with some of the things that are underway as well, there's a lot of development that can be done right now and for the next 20 or 30 years.
We have several million square feet, certainly in Roslyn and throughout the Roslyn-Ballston corridor. One of the major challenges really will be how we deal with these infill sites, these remaining sites that are some of the most challenging in terms of how future growth and development, mixed-use development works in those sites, and how they relate to the edges of those great single-family neighborhoods that are such an important part of Roslyn. And that's where some of the urban design challenges are really going to be before us in terms of how to shape and mold that redevelopment and new development that takes place. So that will be our real challenge, to ensure that we continue to work on those edges, whether they be in Crystal City or whether they be in the courthouse area.
I also think that we have a lot of opportunities right under our feet, places like Courthouse Square. One of my first impressions, I'm a new Arlington resident, and I thought, as walkable as it is, there's just too much asphalt out there. And I think there are opportunities to reinvent our core areas as more pedestrian friendly, more intense, and to start to reclaim some of that asphalt, and not just for pedestrian use, but for also for more intensity. So we will continue to look at these corridors as our source. The other thing I would point out in terms of the affordable housing question earlier is that where are the other opportunities to expand our walkable neighborhood network? Lee Highway was mentioned. So one of the challenges is if we look at these other corridors, how do we expand the footprint of walkable neighborhoods and walkable neighborhood centers? And with that, creating the type of density that will support both the walkability and the retail element, but also provide fertile ground for more affordable housing. We've got to look at these corridors that are underutilized in many ways, being respectful of the edges, but also looking for these infill opportunities that can slowly build over time the type of environments that we have in our core area without compromising the scale, the pleasantness of these lower intense areas. And I think that's one of the things that we're going to be looking at is how do we look at these places and make them as fun and as enjoyable as Clarendon, but in a much more restrained and an appropriately scaled area, so that we can, in other words, expand the opportunities without expanding sort of the impression that we're just becoming one solid urban county.
All right.
Jason.
All right. So just to kind of tack on that a little bit, are there any unexplored corridors in the county perhaps for north and south, or other areas to expand upon outside of our core corridors right now? And maybe that's something we think about in the future, but I don't know if anybody wants to say anything to that.
Well, I mean, Lehigh was mentioned, and again, I don't want to get anybody excited that anybody's thinking about putting Ballston up there. But there are people in that community who are saying, we'd like to have something we could walk to from our single-family house too. And I think some of it is, and that Chris was alluding to a moment ago, creating new kind of town centers that basically enhance the existing neighborhoods, and do what in Columbia Pike people were looking for, which is I've got this great neighborhood. I want a main street, not just a drive-through strip next to me.
Keep in mind that you've got 8 regionally significant walkable urban places in this town: Pentagon City and right here in Roslyn. You should have many walkable urban local serving places as well. Much what Chris has been talking about, little town centers that are the hearts to your little neighbor, to your bedroom community, grocery store, dry cleaners, local doctor's offices. Sort of, Cleveland. Think Cleveland Park. And so it doesn't just have to take this monumental scale. And also keep in mind that the walkable urban development will take, it'll take less than, you've got 10% walkable urban right now. You've got far more than, you've captured far more market demand than most places your size. But if you got to 20%, I'd be shocked. It's no more than that. No more than that. The vast majority of Arlington is going to stay the way it is right now.
I think one of the great recommendations that Arlington put forward when we were reviewing the performance of our comprehensive plan several years ago was just what all three Chris's have talked about in terms of focusing on those small, walkable neighborhood commercial centers that don't have the rich transit support that certainly we planned for and focused on for several decades along the metro corridors. And we're finding now directly from many of our civic associations and neighborhood groups, like those groups are working so hard along Lee Highway to begin to think about a vision and a future for their commercial centers in their neighborhoods along the corridor. That has to be one of our priorities. One of the elements of our work program in the next year and beyond will begin to work with those associations, work with our county board and our planning commission to begin that focus.
Do you have any worldwide examples of best practices for how Arlington County and other urban areas in the U.S. can learn from? So outside of the U.S., what can we learn from?
Oh, there's so much to be learned. Obviously, Europe has a lot to teach us, and I know, I can say that here in Arlington. This is a very educated and traveled town. If I said this in, forgive me, but Cincinnati, I know it very well, they would throw you out. We don't want to learn from those foreigners. They don't want to learn from Canadians. They don't want to learn from people outside of Ohio. That those towns didn't start, their first, the name of the town didn't start with a C, so we can't learn from them. We are a very provincial people in this country. We are among the most, we're certainly, we are the most provincial superpower on the planet. That's pretty easy to say. And we don't want to learn from what they've done. Obviously Paris, but a small town Germany. You could see some of the finest walkable urban places in towns that are 25,000 people that could be applied here. I'm not saying that everybody walks on water there, and they're all singing Kumbaya, but that they've got, even at very small scale, great urbanism. It does not take that large of a population. Hill Valley, obviously it's a fictional town, but anytime I ask people, what size town do you think it is? They say it's 10,000, 20,000 people to support that great little downtown. And it doesn't take much. But so certainly Europe is high on my list. The urbanism of China, I personally would stay away from. They are taking greenfield on steroids, and they're going to be next 100 years, they're going to be redeveloping all the mistakes that they're making now. I think best for us in this country, however, the people that are closest to us from a genetic point of view are the Canadians. Of the top, the top 10 cities on almost any ranking, 4 of them are Canadian cities. So there's a lot to be learned from Toronto. Just don't follow their mayor. Maybe he is following Mayor Barry. But Vancouver and Quebec, these are some, Montreal, some of the finest towns that we can learn from, and they almost sound like us. A boot sound like us.
The one thing I would that I'd like to underscore that you said, without even talking about specifics, which we could do another program on, the neat things we've seen there that we'd like to do here. The main lesson, though, that I think really is important is this: how much is possible, even at smaller scales, when you develop the right way. Because the most dramatic thing to me, Paris is great, and I like Berlin, and we talk about all the big cities. But it's really amazing to see how many great little cities there are, how many great communities there are that have like 200,000 people in them. And then you see some of these, and you and I were in Lille, France, for instance, a couple of years ago now, and there's about 200. It's about the size of Arlington. It has an underground subway with automated trains and platform screen doors, and a great walkable central area that includes some fully pedestrian places, and a whole lot of other stuff beside. But the point is that they're able to do this in lots of different cities that have really small size. Our sister city, in France, again, is a couple 100,000 people. And the difference is the development pattern. We have so many places here. If you go to cities all around the country that have a population listed of 100,000 or 200,000 or 300,000, there's very few of them that have any of this. That, there are very few. There's so many of them that if you asked where's the center of town, nobody would know, because there isn't a center of town. There's a fair amount of population and some economic activity, and in some cases a lot of economic activity. But is there a there is another question. And it really is the difference in the development pattern. If you do things in this more compact, careful, long-term way, you get a lot of value even out of small places, and it can all be walkable.
I want to comment on a couple of cities. The Czech Republic, anybody been to the Czech Republic? Amazing place. Go outside of Prague. Go to places like České Budějovice. Go to Telk. Go to Krakow in Poland. These are relatively small cities. The key issue there is the placemaking. The American city sort of evolved around this Main Street approach. The European city evolved around the town square, the market square. I think that the goal that we should have is to start thinking about creating great places and not thinking about corridors for moving people, but for places for people to linger. And for Arlington, we have a lot of sort of chopped up places. And as we look to create opportunities, thinking about the architecture that defines the places is another area I think that we should be exploring. So it's just not, it's sort of getting away from that Main Street model and starting to think about how European cities are sort of defined around the public places that are created. So as we look at opportunities with new development, once again, places like Courthouse Square, how are we going to make that a great place? And that's with great defining architecture, that's with a rational order, and it's about where the building is placed, what the context is. So for me, looking at those smaller European cities is in a way perhaps a better approach, because that is tangible and it's something that we feel comfortable with.
Chris, in your presentation tonight, you talked about place management, which I thought was really important. And you mentioned the role that business improvement districts can play. And early in my career, I had the chance to work with a downtown development corp that also had an early bid, and I learned the role that layer or that mechanism can play. Where are some examples in this country who maybe some of the leading place managers that you could define?
There's about 5 of them that are on the top hit parade. Now they're all in big cities. So, Rich Bradley, who runs the downtown DC bid, is in that top 5. 15 years ago, he started the bid, and you know what downtown was like 15 years ago. Again, there is no great man theory here, but without Rich, a lot of the stuff that's happened in downtown would not have happened. By the way, downtown DC, which was, as you know, a basket case 15 years ago, now generates a net profit to the city of $700 million per year. That's the budget for the school system coming out of 1 square mile in downtown DC. Paul Levy, Center City, Philadelphia, has done a remarkable job. And by the way, for any of you that are looking for a new job, this is a phenomenal career. I've gotten a lot of my students to get into this business. This is being the mayor of 400 acres. And you don't have to kiss babies. It's great. And you can have the job for decades. Paul's been there 20 years. Rich has been there 15 years. And they just make the place better and better and better. And it's because we're barely scratching the surface as to what place management can be. There are so many things that can be done. I just tossed out some of them when I was talking. But and most of it is going to be paid for by the private sector. It's just a matter of letting go and letting the place managers take off. because they're going to find a way to pay for it. Other ones, Steve Leeper in Cincinnati. Steve is one of the most remarkable place managers and catalytic developers. He took a place called Over the Rhine, which 5 years ago, or 10 years ago, had the only race riot in this century in our country. They hushed it up, of course, but it was vicious. And 5 years ago, I would go through Over the Rhine during the middle of the day. I've been in some tough places in this world, and I was scared to death. It was nasty. Drug dealing, prostitution, right out there, constantly. And he's turned it around during the Great Recession. He's turned it around. So there are some really pretty remarkable examples now. There's a fellow out in San Diego who brought back Little Italy. Did you realize that San Diego had a Little Italy? Well, it was about 100 years ago, and Marco, who is Italian, decided to bring it back. And it's back with great Italian restaurants and mixed-use development. It's a downtown adjacent place. And Marco has, I mean, it's one of these little jewels that he's brought back, all within the last 7, 8 years. It's amazing how quick. And then another small town that if you want a small town, my favorite small town is Chattanooga. Downtown Chattanooga is remarkable. I've been working on that downtown for 30 years, and just dint of civic pride that we're going to make this a great jewel.
Okay, Chris, you mentioned in your presentation that walkable urban places occupy 0.88 of 1% of the area within the DC region, and I mean that's small. So I'm curious about how much should it occupy, and this question is kind of tied to that. What can be done for developing bedroom communities that do not have transit or robust transit and density, i.e. Vienna Metro, NOMA, to turn them into a place?
So should is a normative term, and I just follow the data. So if it's 0.88 of 1%, that's what it is. I suspect it's going to be somewhat larger, but even Arlington, just as Chris has mentioned, you're at best half built out. There's still a lot more that you can better utilize the land that you've committed to regionally significant walkable urban places. So it's definitely not going to be 2%. It might get up above 1%, but that's roughly where it is. Now, that's the regionally significant stuff. That's where employment concentrates. That's where regional shopping is. That's where one-of-a-kind civic functions are. That's where government jobs are. That's where eds and meds are. Those are the regionally significant places. The bedroom communities take up a lot of land. And my hypothesis that I've not been able to prove yet, but we're about to do a walkable urban analysis in Boston, and we're going to try to prove this, is that over the next generation, 80 to 90% of all development in this country will take place on no more than 10% of the existing urbanized land in our metro regions. And it might be as low as 5%. So the other 90% is going to be what it is today. It's only the 5 to 10%, both local serving and regionally significant, that'll be densified. So, and there's nothing normative about it. This is just the facts of walkable urban places take so much density. So much density means so many square feet. We only produce so much square footage, and then that's it. So it's a hypothesis.
To underscore that, I think people may have read about 3-4 weeks ago, maybe in the Washington Post, the fact that in the Washington metropolitan area now, there's something like 5.5 million square feet of GFA going up under construction now, and 86% of it is not just near a metro station, but within a quarter mile of a metro station. So, you know, the fact that we have 5.5 million square feet people building this stuff, you know, given where the national economy is itself pretty remarkable. But what is really noteworthy and completely different than would have been the case 15 or 20 years ago is that almost all of it is taking place as close to metro as people can get.
Please join me in thanking Chris Leinberger, County Board Member Zimmerman, and certainly Kris Krider for being here tonight, and certainly Chris Leinberger for his tremendous program. Thank you very much.